You know that nagging feeling you sometimes get when Brazil's productivity gets mentioned in like global comparisons?
Oh, yeah.
There's often this sense that maybe we're not quite, hitting the mark. It's a pretty persistent narrative.
It really is.
And today we're going to dig deep into that. Is that whole perception actually accurate? And maybe more importantly, what's the real impact of this constant measuring up on, well, professionals in Brazil?
Exactly. And we're basing this discussion, this deep dive, on the arguments in Unproductive Brazilian. Neurobusiness unmasks the calculation that kills our self-esteem and real productivity. It's by Marynês Pereira, who's a specialist in neurobusiness.
Right.
So our goal here is really to unpack how these international comparisons are even made, first off. Then explore maybe the hidden assumptions behind those metrics.
Uh-huh.
And critically, understand the psychological fallout, for people working here. We're aiming for a more, let's say, informed and maybe even empowering perspective by the end.
Okay, great. So let's get right into it. This calculation she critiques. When we see these reports, country A is more productive than country B. What's the basic yardstick they're usually using?
Well, typically, these big international comparisons, they boil down to figures like GDP per hour worked or sometimes GDP per employee.
Okay.
The idea basically is to quantify the economic output, right, relative to the amount of labor that went in.
Seems straightforward enough, I guess.
It seems straightforward, but it's really just one way economists look at productivity. It just happens to be the really common one in those rankings, where Brazil often, well, doesn't look great.
Right.
And that's the narrative Pereira tackles, specifically using neurobusiness, applying neuroscience ideas to understand, business behavior. And here, it's about the psychological weight of these economic stories we tell ourselves.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the article argues Brazil has this significant cost disadvantage. She uses this analogy, right? Like a runner carrying a heavy backpack.
Exactly. The backpack represents Brazil's high payroll taxes and social charges.
Ah, okay. So how does that extra cost, that backpack, actually distort the productivity numbers we see? Maybe compared to other places.
Well, that's really the core of the distortion argument.
Mm.
Pereira contends these really substantial taxes on labor, they significantly inflate the overall cost of employing someone in Brazil.
Okay.
So think about it. Even if a Brazilian professional generates, say, the exact same amount of value in an hour as someone doing the same job in a country with lower labor costs, the total cost to the Brazilian company is considerably higher. So when productivity gets framed as output per unit of labor cost, well, Brazil naturally looks less productive in those comparisons.
Yeah, right. So imagine like two equally talented software developers. They both code for an hour, produce the same grit stuff.
Yeah.
But if the Brazilian developer's employment cost is, say, 30% higher because of taxes and charge, then that GDP per hour or GDP per employee calculation makes it look like they were less productive, even though their actual work, their individual output, was identical.
You've got it. It becomes less about the individual skill or effort and much more about the economic environment they're working within.
So these big, widely cited productivity numbers, they're not necessarily reflecting the talent or the hard work?
Not directly, no. According to Pereira's analysis, they're heavily skewed by these embedded labor costs. It reflects the broader economic system, maybe more than the individual worker.
Okay, that definitely clarifies the economic side of the argument. Now let's pivot to the neurobusiness angle. How does hearing this constant kind of negative message Brazil is unproductive, how does that actually affect professionals here psychologically?
Yeah, this is where Pereira's neurobusiness lens is really, really insightful. She argues this persistent negative story, it chips away at professional self-esteem. It feeds into something Nelson Rodriguez famously called the complexo de vira-lata.
The underdog complex.
The underdog complex, exactly. The sort of national inferiority complex. When you have what seem like objective numbers, these productivity stats, constantly telling you you're lagging behind, well, the psychological impact can be pretty significant.
And what's happening in the brain, neurologically speaking, when we start to internalize that kind of feedback?
Well, from the neurobusiness perspective, Pereira outlines our brains react to that negativity. It triggers stress responses, self-critical thoughts start swirling.
Right.
And chronic stress. That means elevated cortisol levels. And that has a real, tangible negative effect on key cognitive functions. She specifically mentions things like motivation taking a hit.
Okay.
Lower willingness to take calculated risks, problems with focus and attention, and it can even stifle creativity and strategic thinking.
Wow. So the very things you need for high-value work.
Exactly. The irony is thick, isn't it? These are the absolute crucial abilities for driving real productivity, the high-value kind.
So it's like a vicious cycle. The narrative suggests low productivity, which creates stress, which then actually hinders the brain's ability to perform at a high level.
Precisely. It can become a self-defeating loop. The core neurobusiness argument here is that the perception of low productivity, even if it's based on, let's say, flawed or incomplete calculation, that perception can morph into a self-fulfilling prophecy. It actively undermines the potential for real productivity, both for individuals and, writ large. The psychological bit isn't just a side effect, it's actually a contributing factor to the problem itself.
Okay, so the article paints a clear picture of the problem and its mental toll. What about solutions? Does Neurobusiness offer ways to kind of break free from this label and, tap into our full cognitive potential?
Yes, it does. Pereira suggests several key shifts in mindset, really grounded in how our brains process this stuff. First, and this is critical, she stresses the importance of understanding how these productivity numbers are actually calculated.
Right, getting under the hood.
Exactly. By recognizing why Brazil might look less productive in those rankings, the tax structure inflating costs, people can avoid internalizing it. It stops being about, I'm not good enough, and becomes, okay, the metric has limitations.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like separating the measurement from your actual worth or capability. What else does she suggest?
Second, the article pushes for shifting focus. Move away from just looking at the cost of labor input and focus instead on the actual value being generated, the tangible results achieved.
Oh,
Because that's what truly matters in business, right?
yeah.
Solving problems, innovating, creating value. And those are areas where individual professionals do have direct influence, regardless of national tax policies.
So changing your internal scorecard, basically.
Yeah.
Focusing on impact over just, cost-adjusted hours.
Precisely. And the third key point flows from that. Building a really robust sense of professional self-esteem, but based on solid internal factors.
Like what, specifically?
Like your actual skills, your dedication, your ability to learn and adapt, which is huge, your resilience when things get tough, and the concrete contributions you make at work. Pereira encourages grounding your self-worth in these things.
Because those are immune to the biases in those big international economic comparisons.
Exactly. They're your internal metrics, unaffected by external calculation quirks.
And didn't the article also mention technology? Something about AI. How does that fit in?
Yes, good point. Pereira highlights leveraging high-impact tech, like artificial intelligence. The idea is that AI can take over a lot of the routine, process-heavy tasks.
Right, the grunt work, maybe.
Kind of. And that frees up our valuable human cognitive energy, our brain power for the higher level stuff. The things humans excel at, strategic thinking, creative problem solving, real leadership.
Okay.
So in this view, AI isn't a threat, but a tool to actually amplify our inherent productivity by letting us focus on where we add the most unique value.
It's like letting the machines handle the mentally taxing bits, freeing us up for innovation. Makes sense. Now, Pereira's expertise is clearly neurobusiness. Does she acknowledge this as one perspective or invite others?
Yes, she does. And that's important. She explicitly states her analysis comes from that neurobusiness angle, focusing on the psychological and neurological side of these economic narratives.
Okay.
She's clear she's not an economist herself, and actually includes a direct call for economists and other experts, too, to jump into this conversation.
To add their perspectives.
Yeah, particularly to further explore the impact of these cost structures and maybe discuss alternative, perhaps more nuanced ways to measure productivity across such different economic systems.
So it's offered as a vital piece of the puzzle, but definitely inviting more discussion from, different fields.
Definitely.
Okay, so as we sort of wrap up this deep dive into Unproductive Brazilian, Neurobusiness unmasks the calculation that kills our self-esteem and real productivity, what's the main thing sticking with you? The key takeaway?
For me, the central insight is really twofold. First, that the common story about Brazilian worker unproductivity, while reflected in certain metrics, just doesn't capture the whole picture, especially the impact of systemic things like the tax burden.
Right, the context matters.
Hugely. And second, perhaps even more importantly, is recognizing the real, measurable negative impact this narrative has on psychological well-being, and how that, in turn, can actually suppress the very productivity we're talking about.
Yeah, it really seems understanding the mechanics behind the numbers and then consciously shifting our own focus towards the value we create, the results we achieve.
Right.
That feels crucial.
Absolutely. And maybe the most empowering final thought, echoing Pereira's conclusion, is this need to shift our thinking, move beyond an outdated sort of 20th century focus on just hours worked,
Right.
and really prioritize the value and the results that are delivered. So this deep dive, inspired by Marynês Pereira, who, by the way, holds a master's in neurocoaching, certifications in positive psychology and quantum physics. She's a behavioral analyst with decades of corporate experience.
Impressive background.
Yeah, it really encourages you, the listener, to maybe question your own assumptions about productivity. What does it really mean, and what truly drives high performance for you?